This is the UMI-Digi Z2, and it's one of those budget smartphone devices that, on paper at least, has a lot going for it, and yet I always find myself being a bit apprehensive with these sorts of devices because whilst they promise so much on paper, they can often fall flat in one or two major areas. So let's find out whether this phone is the same or perhaps a different story altogether. So the first thing to talk about is the design, and in my opinion, this is one of the biggest pros of this device. Whilst it doesn't stand out as a groundbreaking new design, it does feel ultra premium in the hands, and the curved glass rear along with the metal sides certainly makes this device feel a lot more expensive than the price tag would suggest. Along with that, whilst the buttons are really clicky and tactile, which I like, I would have appreciated the volume buttons being repositioned to the other side of the phone, which I think would prevent a few accidental mistouches. But when you flip the device around, the first thing you'll undoubtedly notice is that notch. Whilst it's not quite as big as the iPhone Xs, it's certainly not the smallest you'll come across as well, so take that for what it is. But I personally don't mind it at all because the display underneath it is pretty spot on. Now, whilst it's certainly not going to get points for being the brightest display on the market, and it also suffers from that annoying trend in budget smartphones where you can't seem to dim the display enough for nighttime use, the actual pixels themselves are pretty top notch here. It is an IPS panel, so colors aren't quite as punchy or as rich as what you might have become accustomed to on an OLED display, but it does a pretty good job and it holds its own as a good looking panel. But taking a look at the software experience of this device, and for budget smartphones, this can often be a make or break area, but for the Z2, this is actually one of my favorite features. So surprisingly, this phone runs a near vanilla version of Android, meaning it is just about as close to stock as you can get, with just a few added features such as flipping the phone over to mute it or double tapping the power button to jump into the camera. But aside from that, it is really bare bones, which may not be everyone's cup of tea, but I personally really enjoy the experience. Now, initially out of the box, I actually found this device to be a little bit glitchy, not in its overall performance, but 2 to 3 times a day, the phone would actually completely freeze and shut itself off before rebooting again, to the point where I was getting ready to come here and tell you guys to steer clear away from buying this device. But luckily, a software update came through just in time for this review, and since then, the phone's been running fairly flawlessly with not a single freeze or reboot. That said, you're not going to experience lightning fast performance either when using this device despite the 6GB of RAM, and I think that mainly comes down to the MediaTek chipset inside, which just never seems to perform as well as the chips from Qualcomm, but overall, the software makes the experience enjoyable. And so now we turn to the things that I'm a little less enthusiastic about, the cons of this device. And for the most part, the negative aspects of this phone really come down to some of the inconsistencies of what we're presented with on paper compared to what we actually get when we turn the phone on. And the first thing is the camera. Now, by no means is the camera actually that bad. In fact, in decent lighting conditions and in some low light scenarios as well, most people wouldn't bat an eyelid at the images this phone produces. But the issue is with the dual camera setup. To the best of my knowledge, based off of using this phone for several weeks now, the secondary cameras on both the rear and the front of the device appear to be fake, which is unfortunately a more common issue than you might be aware of when it comes to budget smartphones. But I don't get the mentality here. I think the manufacturers would be much better off just placing a single lens on the phone and just being honest with the setup that they're giving to us. What this means is that any so-called portrait or bokeh mode is in fact fake, and you'll figure this out pretty quickly. And I do miss this feature, but to be honest, I'm not hugely surprised it's not a real feature included on this phone given the price point. But with that said, photos on the real single sensor aren't all that bad and will satisfy most casual photographers, but as expected for the photography aficionados out there, then you probably already know that this isn't a device for you. Now, as for the battery, it gets a solid pass with around 4.5 to 5 hours of screen on time a day, sometimes less depending on how hard you push the device, but you should get through a full day without needing to plug it in, and that's for the better because even though a quick charge feature is present on this device, it's not nearly as quick as much of the competition. And speaking of lackluster speeds, the fingerprint sensor also gets a solid pass. It's definitely not the quickest or the most accurate that I've come across, and it is a bit slow to wake up your device when your display has been off, which I think is a software issue more than anything else. The only other thing worth mentioning is the lack of a notification LED, and it seems odd to me that I would miss this feature as much as I have, but after taking it for granted for so many years, I've definitely found myself wishing it was here. But that's where the narrative kind of ends with the Z2. Despite its flaws, I actually do believe that this phone is a solid daily driver option, particularly if you're looking to jump on that notch train without breaking the bank. I've actually been using it as my daily driver for the better part of a month now, and whilst there's a lot of room for improvement for UmiDigi going forward, I definitely think the Z2 is a phone that plays its part in bridging the gap between premium and budget devices. Just before you click out of the video, I do want to quickly thank Gearbest, as they were the ones who sent me this device to review for this video. I've placed a link to where you can buy this phone on their website down below, so make sure you go and check them out. As I've mentioned in the past, I'm also an affiliate with them, so any purchases you make using that link will help to earn me a small commission. And if you're interested in supporting the channel, then that is a great way to do so. But aside from that, thank you guys very much for watching, and I will catch you later.